Despite the exhilarating times aboard the space exploration vessel, the cruiser Orion's bow, life was still harrowing and often life-threatening. Far too frequently, for Zabor's liking, the crew faced a multitude of exotic new threats, from colossal beasts to giant monsters, and even a self-styled emperor of space. The Red Scale E.G., Zabor, had witnessed more horrors than any one individual should endure and yearned to return home to the E.G. conglomerate. Humans had a saying about this kind of predicament, calling it a wish upon a monkey's paw. Though the term was outdated and its origins unknown, the meaning remained consistent. A wish would be granted, but in a way that one would come to regret making it. Zavor's wish to return home was granted through convalescent leave. Multiple broken bones and significant blood loss had rendered him fit for duty only after extensive recovery. His friends and the crew of Orion's bow deemed it safer for him to be sent home until he could fully recuperate. However, this monkey's paw twist meant that Zavor wasn't simply allowed to convalesce as a war hero, admired for his bravery, size, and deep red scales. On top of that, he was required to return to the bow once cleared for service. Additionally, Zavor was mandated to lecture at the military academy the moment he could leave the hospital. Over generations, multiple military academies across various continents on the E.G. home planet of Tarvan had consolidated into the Tarvan Military Academy. This magnet school recruited the best of the best from across the conglomerate's space sectors. Despite his impressive service, Zavor had not been invited to attend Tarvan Academy, leading to even more resentment. Now, he was ordered to lecture at a place that had previously deemed itself too prestigious for him. His injuries were no longer life-threatening, but had been downgraded to extremely inconvenient. His broken bones had been set, and fragments either extracted or glued into place, so he no longer had to worry about ruptured organs from excessive movement. Of course, this led the military man to grow stir-crazy, resulting in his assignment to lecture at Tarvan Military Academy. The lecture halls at Tarvan were similar in shape to human ones, barring planets with unusual particle contents in the air. The laws of acoustics were essentially universal. The professor was an attractive E.G. woman named Yaren, only a little older than Zavor himself, quite young for E.G. academia, as she had joined the military as soon as she was able. Her beige scales were bright and healthy, her conical skull tapering to a nice feminine point at the back. Her short body was broad, advertising her fertility and showing off to any potential mate that she could produce a large clutch of eggs. Zavor rolled into the room, seated in a tracked mobility chair since his wounds were still too grievous for extended walking. The students immediately reacted with sounds of quiet awe at the sight of him. The petty officer inwardly smirked, knowing he was an impressive specimen. His scales were a deep red, an incredibly rare color among his species. His skull came to a broad, shallow point like a gumdrop. He was slimmer than most necks, but his sheer height made up for that deficiency, nearly as tall as the average male human. Professor Yaren began with a pleasant gurgle in her voice. "You've been assigned to a role in the human space exploration fleet. Could you tell us a little bit about what that's like?" Zavor tipped his head back into the right, his people's equivalent of a self-effacing smirk. EEG mouths did not lend themselves to subtle gestures, and could only bare their teeth when it was time to bite, an inherently terrifying expression. His voice was a deep growl, or perhaps horrifying is a better term. Yaren went on a tangent about the difference between terror and horror. Apparently, terror is the anticipation of something frightening, while horror is the actual experience of it. She paused, realizing she'd gotten ahead of herself, and encouraged him to start from the beginning. "I've been assigned to a human light cruiser called Orion's Bow," Zabor began. "It's named after a weapon of a hunter from human mythology. The humans call it a Hab ship, a starship capable of self-sustenance. The bow has an elaborate hydroponic system that provides food, water, and oxygen for its contingent of crew. We supplement the bland food with normal rations, but if we run out of supplies, we could theoretically sustain ourselves indefinitely. Orion's bow is under the command of Captain Trent Riley, a male human." Zavor took a moment to look out at the class, seeing numerous pairs of bright eyes staring back at him. "You've all seen humans, right?" At the gentle murmurs of affirmation, he continued, "Human naming conventions are strange. They typically have two names, which they share with relative freedom. The first name is personal, and the second identifies the family to which the human belongs. On human ships, We typically address humans by their family name." He paused to figure out where he'd left off when he'd barely even started. Captain Riley takes what he calls a hands-on approach to leadership. He can often be found conversing in person with those he wants to communicate with, despite the fact that humans have the same means of distance communication as the rest of us. Honestly, they take their communications to another level. Each human has a personal comm device attached to their hip, and I've seen this on humans outside of the bow as well. But Riley prefers to meet in person when possible, so you'll often see him wandering the ship. Zavor chuckled, mostly to himself. "The first time I saw him moving, I thought I had done something wrong or we were in danger. The captain has a way of stalking through the corridors like he's on his way to attack something, but that's just how he moves," Yaren observed. "It can be," Zavor said. He admitted. All humans are imposing in their own way. They casually ignore extremes of temperature, their immunity, and combat training, but they're also often disarmingly friendly. Humans are earnest in a way that's difficult to express. I've seen the captain employ great duplicity in negotiations. It's not as if they can't lie or don't understand it, but I think the dangers of their daily lives have led them to value honesty and straightforwardness in a way we might not." Zavor took a breath. Riley's executive officer is a man named McBride, and the commander is a harder man than Riley. Not a bad person, but perhaps sharper is a fair term. Riley has a natural aggression, but it's not directed at his crew. McBride is stern, always watching for signs of weakness or disloyalty among his crew. There were a few murmurs along the student body. "These humans are sounding more and more dangerous," one student thought. It took Zavor a while to accept that Lieutenant Kellen Yaren is in many ways her commander's opposite. She's soft, gentle, a clutch mother, as you might say. It felt a poor fit to have her aboard a military vessel. However, on his first mission with the bow, she was instrumental in a smooth victory. Kellen is unconventional, and her kindness helps to counterbalance McBride. One of the students near the back piped up, "Is it true that humans live in fire?" Zawor's left and right eyes dilated in brief confusion. "Not as far as I know, but it is true that humans have incredible durability in different biomes and conditions. They can endure cold that would cause irreparable damage to us, but can also live comfortably in temperatures we would consider warm." That was a shock to the students. They identified most of their lifetimes with St. Paul and Oliver and have been from macroscopic to cultivated memories with them, but having it spelled out like that was still impressive. That's part of the reason why those who work on human ships have to be carefully vetted, and why no non-human has yet set foot on Earth. The comfortable temperature for humans aboard the Orion's bow is dangerously close to being too cold for my good health. Yaren glanced over with her leftmost eye. The humans have a Jurian engineer. Humans' animosity with the cold-weather Avens was well known. The Jurian Federation had a war machine that had overrun all individual stellar nations until it met a barely shock-capable human commonwealth. The two militaries fought to a standstill, and it was debated whether the humans would have managed to win if the war had continued. Zavor chuckled. "I was surprised too when I first heard about it. McBride isn't a Federation native, though her parents were refugees and raised her in a nick space that was basically all the explanation that was needed. The Ford insectoids were strange to the rest of the galaxy, and someone raised among them wouldn't behave the same as warmongering Dians." Professor Yaren addressed Zavor again. "So for those who might aspire to work on a human ship, what is the average day like?" Zavor spread his arms. "Well, honestly, it's not terribly different from most other vessels. What's more unique is living on a HAB ship rather than the fact that the crew are humans. One of the biggest things to note with humans is that they're quick to form cliques. These aren't necessarily exclusionary, but humans love to form or adopt small tribes, usually based on proximity, such as engineers assembling into one group. However, that's not a guarantee. Each little group has its own inside jokes and behavioral conventions, so you need to learn how to navigate these. Keeping to standard human attitudes until you're welcomed into the clique is generally the best approach." The injured lecturer took a moment to remember where he'd left off before the question sent him on a different tangent. "Well, you asked what life is like, and I said horrifying. To elaborate, I don't think my experience was normal, at least, I hope it was not. My first mission, which was intended as a simple shakedown operation, turned into a battle to stop a cult and rescue captives. Very few operations go smoothly without some surprise or twist. We fight for our lives, and many people lose theirs. The humans are hardy, but they can't fix everything. A girl in the middle of the crowd, with scales so pale they were nearly gray, piped up, "What was the scariest situation you found yourself in?" Zavor took a moment to consider. "There are a lot of candidates, and I know how awful that sounds. I've probably been in worse situations, but the sheer panic of being chased by a giant monster stands out as the most terrifying. We crash-landed on a death world in the southeastern fringe," he elaborated. The galactic southeast was no man's land, populated almost entirely by pirates, warlords, traffickers, and people like him, and madmen. It was unknown if there were sapient species in that nebula, perhaps a different group of trespassing, sapient, a choked mass of stars. But the discovery of humans at the edge of the fringe, and the subsequent revelation that they lived on a world with a molten core, and were intimately familiar with the horrors of death worlds, had inflicted generational trauma upon the galaxy. This caused many stellar cartographers to reissue their galactic maps with the classic HBY monsters line over the vague mass of the galactic southeast to shorten it. Long story short, I found myself being hunted by a gigantic insectoid monster, easily the size of a small freighter. Zavor mentioned a beast the size of a 2-story home was even more unsettling. It tore open my back, and if it hadn't been for Carver's first aid spray, I'd likely be dead. I had to lie there while the humans killed the thing. The Marine had helped me hide out of the massive beetle's reach, but that left me so injured, the girl asked, clearly meaning his current state. "Did you leave?" Zavor gave a quick jerk of his head in the negative. "No, that was months ago now. I think, if not a little longer. Time tends to blur on deployment, especially aboard a ship that doesn't actually need to restock its supplies." Another student near the front, a young man with brown scales, politely raised his hand on the subject of injuries. "I've heard rumors about humans living through impossible things. Have you seen anything like that?" Zavor tilted his head back with another smirk. "You have to be more specific," he quipped, continuing before the boy could refine his question. "I've seen humans do insane things, and heard tales of far more. One that stands out to me had to do with Captain Riley himself. When we fought that giant monster, it hit him in the leg, and Riley was limping until we got back to the ship, where the medic explained that his knee had been dislocated. The joint was completely forced out of the socket. To an EEG, that meant a crippling injury with only the slightest chance to heal. The medical officer wrenched the captain's knee back into place, and after a night's rest without straining it, Riley was walking around like new." Zavor finished his story, and the student was stunned. "How is that possible?" The red EEG tapped his chin to his left shoulder in a shrug. "Humans are more flexible than Nasab or Dians. Their tendons and ligaments can stretch to degrees that would be devastating to other species, and they seem built to pop their joints back into place." He clenched his teeth in a grimace, remembering how Lieutenant Danica Kellen's smooth flexibility had allowed her to stand from a stealthy crawl when his more limited range of motion had forced him to walk, his hands up a wall, to stand without fanfare. Now, I asked about it. Nearly everyone on the crew had a story of a dislocated joint, usually at the shoulder or sometimes the hip. The knee is apparently rare to dislocate, but it's still fixable. Another student spoke up. "Was that the worst injury you saw?" Zavor gave his head a brief side-to-side jerk. "Nope. The worst injuries were probably the deaths in the crash that led to that fight. But if you're asking about survivable injuries, still no." He took another breath. "Many of the worst I saw personally was with Turnbull, one of the Marines. The biggest man on the cruiser by a fair margin. Turnbull was also an adrenaline junkie who sought out combat as his drug of choice. I still don't know exactly what they were doing, but a few of the Marines and crew were playing some sort of game in one of the bays. Apparently someone bumped something he shouldn't have, and one of the shuttles started rotating. The wing caught Turnbull in the leg at a bizarre angle, and the bone in his upper leg broke in half. It was so bad that the splintered bone tore through his skin and jutted up through his thigh." A collective shudder went through the class as they envisioned the injury. "Did he have to go on convalescence leave?" the student asked, since Zavor had said this was not a lethal injury. "Nobody had to ask if the Marine had died, but that still sounded awful," Zavor replied. "Amazingly, no," the red scale EG replied. "Humans keep first aid spray on hand pretty much everywhere. It's some sort of aerosolized sealant that keeps blood in and particulates out. It certainly saved my life when that monster tore my back open. If Carver hadn't used some to stop my bleeding, it's unlikely I'd be alive today." he added. As a result, they sprayed over Turnbull's wound and called for a stretcher, taking him to the medical bay. There, the medic dissolved the spray and grabbed the bone, wrenching it back into place. He motioned with his hands to emphasize how this might have happened, clutching at some imaginary protrusion and forcing it down. Another collective groan went through the crowd as they moved through a little more than half of the students, the remainder more in disbelief and unable to accept that such a thing was real. Then he used organic glue to bond the bone together, sealed the wound, and put Turnbull in a cast. Before calling him an idiot for being unable to work for about a month, they all made fun of him. A collective laugh rose from the crowd. The question about fire earlier did remind me, Zavor mused about Carver. Most human military personnel have at least a few scars, but Carver seems to have more scar tissue than undisturbed skin. He's not much older than the rest of the Marines, so I don't know if he's incredibly fortunate to have survived all those things, or incredibly unlucky to have gotten into so much trouble in the first place. He took a breath. I haven't asked about all of his injuries. It just feels rude, as though I'd be treating him like an exhibit. His voice was raspy from fire damage. The worst thing is hearing him tell it. He got the injury on his leave. That statement seemed to have the class on the edge of their seats, so Zavor continued. Jacob Carver was looking forward to some much-needed time off. The war against the Drian Federation was over, and he had lost too many friends to the Avens. While he had re-enlisted, he was thankful that he wouldn't have to fight any more of the damned Spengans and deal with the aftermath of the war. Humanity had earned respect and the chance for friendship among the stars. Already, the higher-ups in the Space Exploration Force were preparing to travel into galactic neutral territory to discuss colonization rights, wanting to go through all the proper channels to reinforce that humans were good neighbors when given no cause to be bad ones. The politicking had no real interest to Jacob. He simply wanted to relax with a nice STP in from the SCF. He secured a hotel aboard the Tensi Habitat, orbiting Saturn, where he could spend some much-needed time decompressing, partying, and indulging in the basest human passions. Then he got to his hotel, unpacked his luggage, and changed into a nice outfit. The dark gray jacket went well with his close-cropped brown hair and chocolate eyes, and it didn't make his skin look too pale by comparison. His scars still made themselves known, but he just had to live with them. They make good conversation starters in some cases, and the adage holds true. Far more often than not, people find scars intriguing. He headed downstairs and ordered some drinks at the hotel bar, getting a nice buzz before properly setting out for a night in the town outside the void of space. A minor chunk of the Drian warship spiraled through the blackness. For the most part, salvage efforts had cleaned up the debris for recycling and study, as much as for safety. But in the aftermath of a war, pieces could go missing in the sheer vastness of outer space. In any other situation, this would have no impact. Every station in arcology had a network of rail cannons to destroy approaching stellar detritus. This particular detritus, however, was a chunk of a starship, including its exterior plating. The automated weapons performed their duty, identifying that the approaching object was not a spacefaring vessel, and then opening fire. But rather than breaking the offending debris into small space dust, the shots sheared it apart. Most of the metal was eventually destroyed, but a shard of the structural support beam hurtled toward the space station like a spear. Alarms blared across Tensai as the fragment caught in Saturn's gravity accelerated toward the habitat. Despite the fact that the habitat ceilings displayed an artificial sky, everyone reflexively looked up. The ceiling burst open as the piece of superstructure drove through the station's plating like a tack, and then violent decompression ripped it back out. Air surged out of the habitat section with such force that people and objects were pulled from the ground and funneled toward the breach. In the moments between the impact and the deployment of the bulkheads to cut off the rupture, people and vehicles were pulled hundreds of feet into the air. Smaller structures were ripped from their foundations, accelerant dripping from torn pipes met with active electrical wires, then fast-spreading fires ignited. It was as much luck as skill and instinct that saved Carver's life. The sturdy veteran had grabbed the nearest big object, clinging to a truck and crawling alongside it as the vehicle spiraled through the air. When the vacuum suction cut out, he leapt onto a nearby building rather than riding the truck back down to certain death. The building he found himself on, however, was in an unhealthy state. He could smell and hear fire and screams for help rising from within. Staying on top was a death sentence, as response teams would have far bigger problems to deal with than plucking a single man off the roof of a burning restaurant. Carver had to brave the flames and get out before they became impenetrable. He threw himself against the rooftop access door several times before it finally gave way. His expletive turned into an aborted yelp as he had to ride the door like a sled down a flight of stairs. There was no way this place was up to code. The door hit the wall at the bottom of the stairs, meaning he subsequently hit the wall, barely managing to turn and impact with his back, rather than his head and neck. He staggered out into a forked hallway, wandering into the kitchen. From there, he presumed the double doors led to the dining area. Several of the ovens had been damaged by falling debris, ripping through the wall, and fire blazed along the side of the kitchen. The screams had mostly died down, but he could still hear a single high-pitched shriek coming from the dining area, giving the flames a wide berth. Carver pushed open the doors to find a conflagration engulfing much of the area. He couldn't presume to know how it traveled from the kitchen, or if these had been concurrent fires, and honestly, he didn't much care. He could hear a child's voice, a young girl pleading, "Please, please, help! Anybody! My dad's trapped!" Carver staggered forward, coughing into the smoke. He shucked his jacket and wrapped it around his face. It wasn't as effective as a soaked shirt, but anything would do to filter out the particulates. "Where are you? I'm coming over here!" the girl shrieked. By the bar, Carver found a blonde-haired young girl, probably less than 10 years old, with the light tan of living under ultraviolet arcology lighting. She was crouching down to avoid the cloying smoke overhead, struggling against a palmless structure, something that had fallen from the sky. A second quickly retrieved an arcology, moving toward the watery slopes of overhead, struggling against a pair of legs still twitching. "Stand back. I need to get around this. And I don't want to step on you," he warned the girl. Carver studied how the ceiling structure had come down, the angle at which it lay. "All right, I need you to be strong, girl," he said to her. "When I lift this, grab your dad's leg and pull with all your might. You have to drag him out of here, and don't you dare give up, even if it feels like your bones are breaking, until I say so." The girl nodded, her bright green eyes shining with tears. The scarred military man squatted down and worked his fingers under the frame. His groan of effort rose into a roar of exertion as he lifted the enormous weight. The girl mirrored him, letting out a ragged, ear-rattling scream as she clutched her father's ankle and pulled. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the man moved. He had been pinned, awkwardly. When his first arm came free, her father proved he was still alive and conscious by grabbing for purchase and helping his daughter pull him free. Finally, Carver let the mass drop, collapsing onto his heels and gasping for air. "You okay, man?" he asked the father. The doctor hesitated, staring back at him. "Yeah." The other man, who had brown hair and blue eyes, wheezed, his eyes widening in distress and panic. Having seen similar situations before, Carver quickly diagnosed it. "Lay on your back again. Your windpipe's been crushed. You keep wheezing like that and can't close it completely. Just focus on slow, shallow breaths." Carver needed to perform a field tracheotomy. Thankfully, the bar would likely have a metal stirring straw. He climbed over the debris and began shuffling through the detritus behind the bar for his prize. Too late, he noticed the hissing noise of a gas pipe breaking in a panic. Carver grabbed a handful of simple plastic straws instead and tried to leap backward, but the gas was already igniting. A stream of fire, like a dragon's breath, washed over him, flooding his face. He reflexively closed his eyes and gasped in pain as the flame rushed down his throat like a pack of ravenous hounds, clawing and biting at everything. His eyebrows and most of his hair were seared off. Jacob Carver staggered back to the man and child, coughing and shaking. It was his turn to breathe. His vocal cords were too raw and ragged from the scorching fire. He dropped to his knees and drew his field knife, gesturing with the knife and straw, hoping the man would understand. The father looked frightened, tears of anxiety beating at the corners of his eyes, but he gave a thumbs up and a brave smile to his daughter. Carver gestured to himself, taking a deep breath, waiting for the man to follow, then gave a motion he hoped the man would interpret as, "Hold it." The veteran lightly jabbed the knife just above the curve of the man's sternum, piercing the flesh and causing blood to well. He then wedged the straw into the opening and pinched it with 2 fingers to gently hold it in place. He theatrically exhaled, gesturing for his impromptu patient to do the same. A spattering of blood shot out the straw. Carver smiled and nodded with the father, who was now taking weak but steady breaths. Carver looped one of the man's arms around his shoulders and carried him out. The father's other hand was occupied holding his daughter's hand. Professor Yeren was the first to react when Zavor finished recounting Carver's story. "That's incredible," she murmured. "We hear stories about how humans survive on death worlds, but it's just so far outside of our realm of expertise. Stories like this help us better understand exactly what it means that humans are a death world species." Zavor chuckled softly. "That's not the conclusion I drew from that, Professor. Although it was the first time he'd heard it, he'd lived among the humans for several months." The beige-scaled professor tipped her hat silently, requesting for the red EG to continue his train of thought. "For humans, life ends more often and in more disturbing ways than most of us could imagine. I don't ask about Earth's predators or cataclysms anymore." Zavor shook his head. "It'd be easy to hear all the things we do about humans and conclude that they are grim people, careless of death, because it happens so often. The way they plan for mass death could make us decide that they consider life to be cheap. But, from what I've seen, that is not the case. Humans value life in themselves and others. They prepare for mass deaths because they see it as inevitable and would rather have as few as possible die rather than losing everyone in a desperate attempt to save everyone." It was particularly resonant because almost everyone knew of a space station or arcology that had been recently refitted to conform to human standards. Human stations have multiple failure points designed to break off and sacrifice a portion of the structure to save the rest. Humans will more often than not risk their own lives to save someone else's because they'd want someone else to do the same for them. They come up with elaborate ways to get around seemingly lethal injuries and preserve vital organs because persistence is human nature. A student raised her hand. "How does that reconcile with stories from the war? I know the Dians were on the other side, so there's going to be some bias, but there are stories of the humans just slaughtering their way through enemy lines, shooting to kill every time, using devastating weaponry for maximum death. How does that align with the humans you portray who value life?" Zavor tilted his head back into another smirk. "I had the same question in my mind after I watched them utterly massacre that cult. It was a slaughter, no quarter given. How could I square that human idiom with the humans who spend so much time ensuring that Mayra and I were healthy?" He paused. "I think I figured it out. As I said before, humans value life in a sense that to them, life is a currency to be spent wisely. They want to ensure that their lives and those of others aren't spent frivolously. But if someone else wants to try ending your life, then you can ensure that they spend their own life as cheaply as possible." From there, the lecture hall fell into a pattern of theorizing about human values, with Zavor for the most part being stumped. Eventually, the class came to an end, and the red-scaled EG was allowed to return to the hospital away from Tarvin Military Academy. He never did manage to get Professor Yeren's number.